Baptist Church, glad to have you with us this evening. I'm Tim Smith, pastor of Calvary Baptist Church. Glad to have those of you that are in the auditorium with us and those joining us on the live stream. On Wednesday nights, we have been studying the book of James, and we come this evening to James chapter 3, verses 13 through 16. So if you could grab your Bible, open to that text. We will be exploring two conflicting views of wisdom, or two opposing views of what wisdom is and what wisdom looks like. So let's begin by reading the text, if you could follow along in your copy of God's Word. James chapter 3, verse 13, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there." James clearly has an agenda in his book to address conflicts in his church. And those conflicts have some theological roots to them, of misunderstanding about the nature of life and particularly problems. And it seems pretty clear by just kind of reading between the lines that some people are in conflict because they are misreading their troubles and lashing out at others and perhaps jealous of others who have fewer problems, or maybe even seen as the cause of their problems. And so there's this back and forth that James is seeking to address. But it's also pretty clear that James is addressing a people who think that they are spiritual. They think that they are wise. You get that idea as James continually uses a phrase or implication of the thought of people that say something about themselves that's good. But James calls that into question, that whether their claim about themselves is really legitimate. So in chapter 1, he was talking about this one that professes to have true religion. Does it match some of the main qualities of what God looks for in true religion? In James chapter 3, the conflict is more out in the open. It's even going to get more so into James chapter 4. And James is seeking to uncover some of the nature of the problem. And one of the nature of the problem, ironically, for people that think they're wise, historically speaking, and even biblically speaking, a wise person is known by his words, by the ability to use words wisely, use words well, productively. That ironically, these people that apparently think that they are wise and they are using words, James believes that they need to rethink the place of their words. And he challenges them to not readily take the role of a teacher, to assume one's going to give some pronouncement about what wisdom is, because teaching requires speaking, and speaking is really difficult. That being wise in one's words is hard. And so he challenges his church and all of us to be careful about spouting off, to be careful with our language, to be careful with our tongues. Because all kinds of evil things can happen by the tongue, even by those who profess to be wise, who think they know it. They have confidence that they are right. They have confidence that they are going to tell somebody else how things are. And James wants to slow them down and cause them to think, do you really know what you're talking about? And so he moves now from the tongue, which is an expression of thoughts of wisdom, to the source and the ideas about wisdom itself. What is wisdom? And how would you know a wise person when you saw one? And so he contrasts two different views of wisdom. He contrasts one that we might call from above. Later in the text, he mentions that there is a kind of wisdom that does not come from above. That is above, meaning heaven, meaning the throne of God, meaning the perspective that judges all things perfectly, that God hears our speech and sees our conduct, and he makes perfect judgment. And so he urges us to seek and advance that wisdom, like Solomon, when he was crowned king as a youth. he is challenged to ask for anything he wills, and he knows that reigning over a kingdom requires more than what intelligence or wisdom comes naturally. He asks wisdom of God, and God grants him wisdom to be a wise and a discerning king. So that wisdom from above that judges and is the true standard of wisdom, versus a wisdom that is, we might say, from below, or that is cut off from the realm of God's wisdom, cut off from the perspective of what God knows about things. So James addresses these things. He starts by talking about heavenly wisdom, and then he ends with it. And in the middle, he speaks about this other kind of wisdom, this conflicting view of wisdom that's from below. I like to look at those first two sections this week and then pick up next week, Lord willing, on putting the whole thing together and looking at the last treatment about what true wisdom or God's wisdom really is. James has been thinking about wisdom right from the beginning of his book, James chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. And so from the beginning, life's difficulties, life's challenges need to be addressed with wisdom. And where we're going to get that? Well, we should get it from God. So from the beginning, we've seen that James has been addressing this idea of wisdom, but we also have seen James skeptical of whether people are as wise as they think they are, whether they really know as much as they think they are. So in verse 1 of chapter 3, he says, let not many of you become teachers. Apparently people were ready to at least play the role of a teacher, to give some confident view of something. And James is questioning whether a lot of people should be doing this, or at least not as many as were doing it in his assessment of their difficulties. So think with me about this first view of wisdom, of heavenly wisdom, that is wisdom from God or wisdom from above. First, just to kind of get an idea what wisdom is. The ancient world is fascinated with wisdom. Our world is more fascinated with facts or trivia, and maybe not as much in view of, in terms of wisdom as the Bible would have us. You know, we have all these great engines for researching all kinds of knowledge about everything. And that, with the advent of the internet and Google searches, you can find about just about anything, you know, with a little bit of search. Wisdom is distinct from that. That wisdom is more related to living than just knowing. It's how to live a life. We might define wisdom from a biblical perspective as the ability that God gives to discern his view of a situation and to take the path towards what we might just borrow from the Hebrew language, shalom. No perfect English translation of shalom. The best translation might be peace, but it means well-being, it means wholesome relationships, it means the good life. So wisdom is the ability to see a situation from God's perspective and to take the path that God has allowed us to discern, leading to peace, shalom, harmony, good relationships with others, a good life. So a basic definition of wisdom. James addresses this topic of wisdom, and he's thinking along those lines. And as we'll see next week, peace and wisdom go hand in hand. And then we'll see the opposite of that today. The absence of godly wisdom is anti-peace. So James says that this heavenly wisdom has certain traits, and the first trait is that is the question, if you're wise, how would you know you're wise? And he says it results in good behavior. That you can tell the wise person not first by what they say, by how they act, by what their behavior is. Their behavior is good. Their actions are good. Their lifestyle is good. So wisdom is seen in its activity. No surprise, James has been tipping his hand in every chapter now that he is not impressed with some kind of faith or claim apart from works. He envisions a Christianity that faith produces a life. It produces a certain a commitment to behavior, and especially in relationship to others. That evidences one's changed relationship with God is expressed in good actions, especially actions in relationship to other people. And so wisdom is seen in actions, not just in words. A lot of people will tell you they know something, and they will go on, and sometimes with quite a lot of confidence about knowing something. James is, let's examine your life. Let's examine what exactly your words look like in terms of your actions. So James is not impressed with anybody winning arguments. In fact, arguments are probably one of the key problems that he's addressing. These conflicts, these sharp words that are going on. James is not impressed by somebody with a witty put-down or a comeback. He's looking for a resulting life that obviously is more peaceful than what arguments imply. And so he's asking these people who are perhaps overconfident in the justness of their position, in the rightness of their position. They are making judgments and pronouncing, letting other people know it. And James is not impressed with what he sees in terms of the actions, in terms of the results of this. And I think the main action here, this wouldn't be in every situation, but in James, and I think appropriate for the context that this is talking about, of wisdom in action, is how it treats other people. That James is interested in people getting along well. He's looking for harmonious marriages. He's looking for children and parents that have a good, positive relationship that's energizing and encouraging to both. He's looking for church members that are helping each other, that are in sweet fellowship, that enjoy getting together and are building each other up. He's looking for relationships on the job that are not driven by strife and competition, but rather he's looking for a lot of evidence that Christianity has brought peace between people. And wisdom ought to be part of that. Of course, the main book in the Bible that we think of in relationship to wisdom, of course the whole Bible is about wisdom in one sense, but one of the main books is the book of Proverbs. And if you think about Proverbs, it has such a strong emphasis upon wise people know how to get along with others. They find ways of peace. They find ways to make peace even with opponents or business competition or partners and husbands and wives that get along well. So wisdom is seen in how one treats other people. And then the word good is provocative because the word good can mean moral good, and certainly it's the idea of good behavior would be moral behavior, but a very close second meaning of the Greek word for good means that which is beautiful, that which is attractive, that which sets one's eyes and mind at ease. If you hear a lovely piece of music, it soothes one's soul. There's something about it that just seems right. It just seems like it should be that way, a beautiful melody with a gentle harmony with it. That wisdom produces something that's attractive, that's settling, that's very consoling. And so one of the traits of wisdom is this beauty of interaction that allows peace, that allows people to think, that's the way it should be. In fact, one perhaps not perfect definition of shalom, that Hebrew word for peace, means the way things ought to be. Kind of that sense of here's the way God created it to be, and that's the goal, to get back to, or to reimagine that state of the Garden of Eden when everything was just lovely. So wisdom is seen in this beauty of interaction. It enables people to interact in a way that both partners and observing people as well find it attractive, compelling. James says that this kind of wisdom is known by meekness. It is known by its gentleness or meekness. One of the key attributes of the wisdom that James rebukes is that of pride, is that of hardness, that is of a biting bitterness that stings and leaves one kind of in a state of resistance and opposition and conflict. The wisdom that comes from God is characterized by the opposite of that, by meekness. What is meekness? The Greek word prautes means gentle. It means to restrain something. James has been speaking a lot in his book about being bridled. And that's the essence of this word. It means restraining something by bridling it. Something that could be strong and dangerous. Something that could be powerful. Something that could hurt you if it would be cut loose. So something that is strong, but meekness implies that something has brought it under control. So the noun of the word meekness is sometimes used of what a tamed horse would be, a bridled horse. It would be a horse that's been trained and bridled, and that strength of that horse, that horsepower, that speed, that endurance, that ability to do what we can't do because the horse is so much stronger, larger, more energy, that horse brought under the service or for the service of another. So that's meekness. Meekness is taking a power that could be dangerous and out of control, but it isn't. It's been brought and it's been restrained. But as opposed to the image of the horse, meekness means willing submission. It means that this has been this power. It's not that someone has chained the person or somehow harnessed them or forced them or threatened them. But meekness has the idea of the willing submission, the peaceful submission of one's power. So it's the perfectly trained horse. It's the person that has maybe emotional strength or strength of character, maybe strength of body even, or social strength, but they restrain that willingly because they want to be helpful to the people around them. They want to use their own talents or their own power to be an asset, to bear the burdens, to carry some load that someone else has. So it's a restrained power that's willingly done. And it also includes the thought of something being done with tenderness, with a carefulness of touch that perhaps is handling a painful wound, maybe a splinter in a hand that needs to be taken out, but it's really sore. Or when I was a teenager out with my friends one day on the baseball field, and we were on this field that they had this gravelly, it almost seemed like broken up bricks. That's how we thought of it, for an infield. And I got carried away. I was out in shorts and I slid all out for a base, trying to be safe. And I was safe, praise the Lord. But I got the worst burn on the back of my leg from sliding in that stuff that just took off several layers of skin. It was just raw and red, bleeding. And then there was all that grain of that gravel and whatever that broken up stuff was all embedded in my skin, and it just hurt. And my grandmother happened to be visiting with us. And she said, "Tim, you've got to get that cleaned out." And I was like, "No, I don't want it to be cleaned out." But she's like, "It has." And she said, "I'll do it." And she just as gentle as she could. But that idea of touching something that's really sensitive That's meekness. So God says, what I'm looking for in someone that knows what they're doing, the wise person, is not someone that spouts off, I'm going to tell you the way it is, but rather someone that has that gentle skill, that knows there's some sensitive areas, that comes at a situation with a way that doesn't want to provoke a hurt response, but tries to find, if possible, now even my grandmother, it hurt, but she was gentle as she could be. But that's the thought of meekness, of using tenderness in handling a problem. And then obviously the thought of all these things is humility, of wisdom that recognizes one's own place, that recognizes and accepts one's position. So, a basic definition of humility is accepting one's place, whatever that is. If one is the janitor, one accepts one's place as the janitor with enthusiasm and willingness. Or if one's the governor or the president or the CEO, one accepts that place and understands what role one's in. So humility is accepting one's place. But it also involves accepting the place of others that may be above one. And that's usually the test of humility, is one's attitude towards the next one up. Frequently we can't worry about the people way up the ladder. They're kind of out of touch, but usually the person on the next rung up is the one that irritates us the most. Maybe the one that used to be at our level, maybe they were even below us at one point, but now they're above us, and we get kicked by them, or we get irritated by them. And humility accepts one's position in relationship to others. Whatever that, whether it's the employee submitting to the boss, or the boss submitting to the proper way to treat one's employees, or the wife submitting to the husband, or the husband being gentle with leading one's children. It's accepting one's place and seeing it worthy as oneself. So James sees that wisdom is particularly characterized by humility, and he's going to press this home for nearly the whole chapter, this chapter, and then on to the next, where humility is one of the key marks of the people that God favors and that God helps. Humility is also important in terms of not insisting on everyone conforming to one's own preference, one's own way. Humility is being willing to perhaps even suffer some deprivation, some inconvenience, that someone else's way might be promoted. That's one of the attributes of a humble person, is that willingness to take, second place, and to actually even aid the one in the first place. So, having briefly looked at the traits of heavenly wisdom, James spends some time addressing what he believes is characterizing too many people in his church. That is a foolish wisdom. Perhaps everybody knows that ever goes to college or maybe even high school, that sophomore is that strange combination of words, the wise fool. Soph meaning, coming from the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom. More, we get the word moron from it. So the wise moron is, the sophomore. The person that knows just enough to be dangerous. Your freshman year, you're kind of stumbling along. But your second year, you know everything. Second year, you've gone through a year and you've got all these people below you. And part of the sophomore year is to learn, well, you might know some, but if you're arrogant, you haven't learned a lot. Because people that are truly wise know how humbling it is. They know how easy it is to mess up. They know how easy it is to be wrong. And so to guard against the foolish wise. Well, James sees people that think they're wise, but he sees them as foolish, and he gives some description of them. If we could just define foolish wisdom, kind of getting a bird's eye view of the basic direction that James is going to take us here in this text is how would we define foolish wisdom if wisdom from above was seeing God's perspective on a situation and acting towards it towards shalom. What is foolish wisdom? Well, foolish, we might use the word clever as a substitute for wisdom, but we might define foolish wisdom as cleverness that's used to subdue others to please oneself on one's own terms. So basically what James is going to describe is using whatever tricks and techniques one can learn to use in relationship to others to get one's way. To figure out how to trick somebody, overpower somebody, go around somebody, bowl over somebody. That foolish wisdom is bent on getting one's way, and we'll see that as James describes it. It begins by talking about the basic root motive of foolishness or foolish wisdom. And James says that it's bitter envy. A bitter envy. Bitter meaning, well, bitter. Something that's harsh, hard, stings. It has an unpleasantness to it. Bitterness, that condition of the soul that just is kind of on edge, like something's piercing, something's jabbing, kind of the opposite of that gentleness. It's got this hardness to it. It's got an edge to it that produces pains or a lot of discomfort. So James says this wisdom from below has this bitterness, and it's a bitter envy. Well, what is envy? Envy is sorrow at someone else's good. When somebody else has something good, envy doesn't like it. It's grieved at somebody's good. It's upset at somebody else's good. So someone else has something, or they had an experience, they have a friend, they have a possession, they have a personality, they have some life situation that the envious person wishes that he had. But he can't have it, so what he does is he despises the person who does. And James says this is the root of this kind of foolishness, this opposition to another's good. So in some respects, it's the opposite of love. If you love someone, you're glad for their good. You are happy that they had some good experience or got a promotion or, whatever they have a spouse that's lovely or funny or whatever we might aspire. That love would be happy, but envy finds it distasteful. So what envy does is rather than, and actually there is kind of a good way, if someone's better than us in some way, respect, maybe they're more talented than us, or maybe they have a car that we might wish we had, or maybe they have some life experiences that we wish we had, the right view of that is to let it inspire us to pray for it, to maybe improve, that we might be as good as that. So there is a proper response to someone having something good. Of course, to love them and be happy about it, but also to let it be a challenge to, hey, maybe if I worked at it. But envy doesn't think that way. Envy thinks in terms of bringing the other person down to one's level. Envy doesn't think in terms of what it could do to rise. Envy seeks to attack or seeks to humble, seeks to bring the other down. So as someone said that it's the idea of rather losing a second eye than allowing another person to have two. So, maybe you lost an eye, another person has two, and it'd be like, I'd rather fight and lose a second eye as long as you don't have two. So it's that idea of hurting another. So the motives of foolish wisdom is that self-orientation that is not really bent on an improvement as much as it is based upon humbling the other. So frequently when you get people like this, they just constantly are putting people down. They love to point out their faults. they'll belittle, they'll gossip about the person and try to show, they're not really as good as they seem to be, or they might humble them to their face that they are, they're just upset at this person, so they're gonna let them know that what they have is not really good at all. So there's usually insults or put downs and this feeling of I can't really get to where you are, so I'm gonna make you feel as crummy as I feel. Bitter envy is the origins of this kind of wisdom. It also, and no surprise because we've been looking this direction, as James says, that it is self-seeking. Self-seeking. In my definition of this foolish wisdom, it's rooted in this idea that foolishness is rooted in self-promotion. It's rooted in self. Self in kind of a self, in an orientation towards one desire that's not being challenged by God, it's not being taught by God, it's just self. It's what I want. It's what I think I must have. And it promotes oneself and it defends oneself. I picked up C.S. Lewis's book this afternoon. I picked up his book, Screwtape Letters, which C.S. Lewis wrote as kind of a tongue-in-cheek satire, a kind of a mocking view of one demon teaching a junior demon how to keep people from being Christians. So it's kind of this tongue-in-cheek view of what might it like if a demon was instructing a more mature demon. In the introduction, actually in the preface to his book, he talks about his view of demons. And he said as he was thinking about writing this book, he tried to get a handle, what are demons all about? What is a demon? I mean, what makes a demon different from an angel? Because in terms of substance, angels and demons are the same. They're both created by God. They're both immaterial beings. So in one sense, they're the same. But what is it? What attitude or what spirit? And Lewis said that the way he finally decided was that a demon was is a person that is dead set on dominating people for one's own way. It's to get pleasure by consuming another person. He called them like cannibals, where they want to, not physically, but they want to just eat somebody up. Paul talks about the problem if you don't live by love, you might consume one another. And that's C.S. Lewis says that's the essence of demons. They love themselves so much, they'll run over and they'll consume whoever's in the way to get that. So that's the motive of this wisdom. It's self-promotion, it's self-defense, it's skeptical about any goodness outside of oneself. It doesn't believe that God is good enough to care for one. Satan had a privileged position in heaven and it wasn't good enough. He believed that God's way was a burden he couldn't handle. He had to have his own way. So his wisdom is that promotion, that self-seeking of it needs to be done my way and whatever it takes to get there. So that kind of wisdom has a lot of enemies. that kind of, if we are the center of our world, then every other thing is going to be an opponent. So we're going to have a lot of opportunities for conflict. We're going to have a lot of opposition because there are going to be other people that are just as selfish as we are, maybe more so, and more powerfully so, or maybe somebody that's really good that stands in our way. So there's a lot of problems of interaction. So James says that can be seen in its arrogance. That is, in its relationship to other people, it exalts itself. It sees itself as superior. So this wisdom is arrogant, it's prideful, it is self-promoting. It, at the same time, is defensive, that it has to defend its territory, so it's self-promoting when possible on the offensive, but it's also defensive and always finding an excuse or finding some rationalization for one's deeds or one's words. But the problem that James says is that if you do this, you have to lie and be opposed to the truth. Because the truth of the matter is that we're not the center of even our universe. We are not the center of all things. God's truth stands as a rebuke. So James says that if you're this kind of wise, you're arrogant, and you have to resist the truth. You have to stand against the truth. So one's argument is that I'm right, and I must be right, even if the truth is that I'm wrong. I don't want to know the truth. That you have to harden oneself against the truth. So the defense of foolish wisdom. James then talks about the origins. Where does this kind of wisdom come from? He says first it's earthly. That is, it's absent of God's perspective. It's absent of God's wisdom. It's cut off from that source. It's merely creature, merely on a low plane, a horizontal plane. It's absent of all that God reveals about himself and in his word. He says it's also sensual. The word sensual is literally the word that we get psychology from. And basically, whenever the Bible uses this word, it's basically one's orientation to oneself without being judged by an outside principle. So being sensual means I'm going to do what I desire to do without regard to principle, without regard to God, without regard to some teaching. Here's what I want, and I'm going to figure out some way to get it. So it's desire without principle. It's passion without a guiding truth that would lead us on a path. And then, as we've already been suggesting, it's demonic. James says that this kind of wisdom is demonic. It's inspired by an anti-God state of mind. That I know better than God. I know better than his word. Here's what I want, and if I have to devour another person, that's so be it. If I have to resist God, fight against God, so be it. It's that demonic sense of insisting upon one's way, as Satan himself would rather rule in hell than to submit in heaven. So that kind of wisdom is going to keep fighting, no matter what God or any of his teachers or other people who may love us would want for us. Finally, James addresses some consequences. Okay, if you choose, in fact, maybe we can think backwards here, is if you see these consequences, you pretty much know how you got there. These consequences come from that kind of thinking. But also, if you engage in this kind of wisdom, here's what you can expect to be the end result. And he says that there is confusion, or the word can mean disorder, conflict. In other words, it's the absence of harmony. God created wisdoms that we might get along, that we might negotiate, we might work out problems. But in this kind of wisdom, all there is butting heads. All there is conflict. Kind of like America, 2021, where there's no possibility of seeing eye to eye. There's no middle ground. There's no wisdom that prevails. And actually, that's probably true. We lack mediating wisdom to negotiate. But Christians certainly shouldn't. But there is, in this kind of thinking, the end result is disorder, conflict. The gears are rubbing against each other, and they're not. The teeth are not lined up, and there's no oil in the machine, and it's conflict. It's grinding, and it's painful to think about, painful to see. Then he says that if this is true, then there's every evil thing. Evil thing means worthless things. So it's the absence of what's good. Worthless means no good. So nothing good is happening. There's no good result. Nobody's better off. Nobody's built up. Nobody is sleeping well that night. Everything, it's the absence of good when there's that every evil thing. So that kind of wisdom that produces arguments and fights and and trying to maneuver around people or run over them. It's the absence of good and the presence of worthlessness. So it's not just there's nothing. Actually, it would be better if there was nothing. But it's not just the absence of good, it's the presence of the corrupt, the presence of the distasteful, the presence of hard feelings, the presence of strained relationships or relationships of animosity even. So it's worthlessness is the end result of it. So a lot of broken relationships. And every evil thing says, I'm not sure where the limit of it is. Now, there is some limit because God doesn't let it go forever. God will quarantine everything to hell that he rejects at some point. But there's no natural limit to worthlessness. It's the rejection of good. So it's lots and lots of trouble. We always need to examine ourselves to ask what kind of wisdom we have. And one of the ways you can know about your wisdom is just to evaluate your relationships. You know, what kind of relationships do you have? Are your relationships characterized by peacefulness, by understanding? You know, you might have a time that you have some tension, you don't see eye, but you come to your senses and you find some way to work out, and that happens. And so that's, someone that has good relationships and peace with relationships is probably a wise person. But someone that is going from one conflict to another, one strife or one argument, one temptation to really let someone have it to another has, James would say, this wisdom from below, this kind of demonic wisdom. So we ought to examine ourselves. James continually is urging us to examine ourselves to see if our profession of faith matches the practice of our lives. Jesus came to promote peace and harmony and goodwill and to make us humble, to make us servants. And so we ought to examine ourselves. What do our relationships, what is the history of our conversations? What does it tell about the kind of wisdom that we have? Are we wise, or do we claim to know something, but the conflicts of our lives betray a different source of wisdom? The answer, of course, is found in humbling ourselves before God in Jesus Christ, who became wisdom from God for us. Not that he came to fight us, not that he came to show us up and to defeat us, except maybe to win us with kindness, to defeat us with kindness. Jesus is the one that can change us and bring us to God. And we ought to both receive him as wisdom and receive his wisdom as a word implanted in our souls. Let's be wise like that. Thanks for joining me this evening. I'd like to encourage you to shift mediums to our Zoom meeting that we might share some prayer requests and praises and some encouragements. So please head on over to our Zoom meeting, and we'll see you there in a few minutes. Have a great evening. Lord bless you. Good night.